Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dale Graham. I'm the Senior Vice President of Philanthropy at Strata Education Network. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the latest findings from our Public Viewpoint, our weekly survey we launched in March to monitor and impact the COVID on Americans' lives, work, and education. Over the past 4 years, Strata has partnered with Gallup and others to interview more than 360,000 people about their experiences and perspectives on education and training after high school. Likewise, this survey is designed to surface consumer perspectives to help inform our understanding of this rapidly changing world and eventually the road to recovery. Of course, we're in a unique and trying moment in our nation's history. Not only are we grappling with the implications of the pandemic, we're also having a critical national conversation about addressing racism in our country. While this event was planned several weeks in advance, today's analysis of America's changing education plans as a result of the pandemic, broken down by race and ethnicity, is more timely than ever. We already know the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on the communities of color, both in health and economic terms. As we chart a path forward, education has to be a part of the solution. It is our hope that this data can help to illuminate the perspectives of individuals and inform the solution. Following the presentation of data, we will have a discussion with several guests who bring a wide range of perspectives to the table. Miles Pendleton, a rising senior at the University of Miami and a Jackie Robinson Foundation scholar, is with us. One of our long-term partners, Amy Eubanks Davis, founder and CEO of Braven, an organization that helps underrepresented young people build the skills, experiences, and networks to enable them to transition to quality first jobs or graduate school. And last but not least, Michael Collins, Vice President at Jobs for the Future, an organization whose programs, research, and investments seek to align and transform education and workforce systems to ensure access to economic advancement for all. We thank you all for joining us today. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Torpey-Sabo of the Strata Center for Consumer Insights to walk us through the data. Nicole?
All right. Thank you so much, Daryl. And as you mentioned, this is the latest in an ongoing series that we've been doing since late March. So if you're interested, you can find those previous reports and webinars on our website, which is strataeducation.org. So this week, we are focusing on differences and disparities that we're seeing by race, ethnicity, and how Americans' work and education has been changed by coronavirus. We'll also look at future plans for education and training and where people turn to for advice on education. Our survey is nationally representative with regards to race and ethnicity. That comes with a few challenges regarding sample size for smaller groups. So you'll see that in some cases we're able to include results for Asian Americans. In other cases where we have questions that are added more recently, we don't have the sample size to be able to do that. And unfortunately we don't have the sample size to report on Native Americans. So just wanted to put out those little caveats and limitations at the beginning. So this first section, we're gonna look at the impact of COVID on Americans' work. And that includes job loss, worries about job loss, and starting new jobs. So here we see that there are differences by race and ethnicity in Americans who have been laid off due to coronavirus. You see that among Black Americans and Latinos, almost a quarter have been laid off, whereas for whites, it's about 15% and Asians about 13%. At the same time, we see even for people who are still employed, that Americans of color are more worried about losing their jobs. We see about 7 in 10 are saying that they're extremely very or somewhat worried about losing their jobs. For white Americans, still high, 55%, but it's disproportionately impacting those communities of color. So next, we also look at people who are starting new jobs. We see here in the past month, the percentage of people who say that they've started a new full-time job or a new part-time job. And we see that that number is higher for Black Americans and for Latinos compared to white Americans. So this nuance is something we'll also be looking at in our next section on education. We'll see that people of color are more likely to have had their education plans disrupted, and they're more likely to say that they plan on enrolling in the future. All right. So as I mentioned, we asked people, these are Americans ages 18 to 65, whether they had changed or canceled their education plans. So again, this is a broader look than just that traditional 18 to 24-year-old student. And our last webinar, May 20th, we got into some of those nuances and distinctions around age or prior level of education. So you can check that out if you're interested. Here, we're looking at race ethnicity. Again, we see that people of color are much more likely to have canceled or changed their education plans compared to white Americans. And so when we see data like this, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and understand, we see these numbers of canceled are really high with, 21% of Latinos and 15% of Black Americans in this age range saying that they've canceled plans. We also wanted to know for those who changed plans, what does that look like? So this slide, we keep that percent canceled there at the top. You can still see that from the previous slide, but we ask a follow-up question for anyone who said that they had changed their plans to try to understand a little bit more what that change means. And people could have selected more than one. We know some people are experiencing multiple types of disruptions. This also isn't exhaustive. People listed more kinds of changes. We're just kind of focusing right now on these most disruptive changes, such as delaying enrollment. And so if you look here at these top two bars for each race and ethnicity, you can see that about 1 in 3 Latinos have either canceled or delayed their enrollment in education due to COVID-19. And that number is about 1 in 4 Black Americans. Again, ages 18 to 65. So this is a pretty broad segment of the population that we're talking about. At the same time, in past recessions, we've also seen that when there's job loss and unemployment increases, a lot of people do go back to school. And so while people's education plans have been disrupted, we're also interested to explore whether their likelihood to enroll in future education might be increasing, as we've seen in the past. And if so, what is their timeline for doing so, and what types of education are they looking for? So here we see, again, some differences by race and ethnicity. So we see that Black Americans and Latinos are more likely to say that they would enroll in education or training at every different time horizon. We asked people about a variety of different types of training and when they would be likely to enroll within the next month, 3 months, 6 months. So you can see all along the way that Latinos and Black Americans at higher rates are saying that they would be likely to enroll in courses and training. At the same time, we know that there's a major concern that learning providers are working through, which is how to reopen and when to reopen and do so safely due to health concerns. And so we asked our respondents as well if that is a concern for them. And when we ask this question, we see that about 1/3 of people are saying that they're worried that pursuing education or training would put them at risk of contracting coronavirus. And those rates are higher for Black Americans and Latinos, and we know that those are communities who have been more impacted by the health pandemic right now. So in our next section, we're going to get into a little bit more about the types of education and training that people are considering. All right. So here, there's several things. I know there's a lot going on here in this chart. A few things I want to point out. We again asked people about the different types of education they might be likely to pursue in the next 6 months. So the first thing I want to note is that people are choosing more than one. As you can see, these percentages, they add up to more than 100 because people are considering different options at the same time. They're not necessarily just set on one path. They're looking at several different options. Second thing to note, as we saw earlier on that slide, Latinos and Black Americans, those light blue and green bars, they are more likely to say that they will enroll in education or training from any of these types of providers compared to white Americans. And then finally, if you look at the different types, you see that that in-person traditional four-year college and university is a lesser choice. You have fewer people saying that they would be likely to enroll in that type of education compared to some of these other types, such as online education, employer-based programs, or community colleges and trade schools. Also then, focusing specifically on Americans without college degrees, who's, as we would think about the people who might most need that additional education and training, we get a glimpse into some of the differences in motivations for seeking that education or training. So if you look at that top green category, you can see that compared to white Americans, Black Americans and Latinos are more likely to pursue education in order to complete a degree, rather than some of these other types of motivations like getting a certificate, certification, or license, or pursuing a course or two for skills or personal interest, which is where you see a little bit more of the motivation for white Americans, that bottom lighter blue box on the left. All right. Finally, we asked people, we wanted to understand, as Americans are considering enrolling in education and training, where would they turn to for advice on that education? So we asked people to rank the value of advice from various sources when it comes to education. Here we see across the board, people rank family as the most valued source of advice. And that's universal, as you can see. However, an important distinction that we find is that for white Americans and Latinos, advice and information from colleges and universities is their second most valuable source, whereas for Black Americans, it's fourth, and it's trailing behind internet and employers. And so here's an area where we need to understand more about these sources of advice and guidance that people are looking to and relying on to help them navigate complex work and education ecosystem. All right, so just a short recap of the data that we've seen. We see that Black Americans and Latinos are more likely to have experienced disruption to their work and to their education plans. At the same time, we see that they're more likely to say that they plan to enroll in education in the future. They're considering a range of pathways, and they differ in terms of where they would turn for advice. So at this point, I'd like to hand it back over to Daryl and to our panelists, who will be giving us some discussion and some Q&A about what all of this means and what they've seen.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was a wealth of knowledge that you shared. We appreciate that. So as mentioned at the top of the hour, we have a terrific panel with us today. I'm really excited to hear their perspectives. We've worked very closely with them, with their organizations and organizations that they represent. And we welcome questions from you all in the audience. So please enter any questions about the data for the panelists in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of the screen. And we'll get to those in a few minutes with our colleague, Jenna Talbot. So as mentioned, Miles Pendleton, a rising senior, University of Miami. I'm a Eubanks Davis, the founder of Braven, and Michael Collins, Vice President at Jobs for the Future. So let's jump in. Miles, thank you so much for joining us. We know that this is a very tough time for you students, but we know that there's a pathway forward in the future for such wonderful students like yourself. You've been very active in your campus and supporting students of color. Can you share with us some examples of how the pandemic has affected you and your peers directly?
Yeah, most definitely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. But now to answer your question, what we've seen is really almost a twofold impact, both tangible and intangible. I would say tangible in the sense that it has had a tangible impact on people's ability to learn, I would say. As we're moving through these online courses due to COVID-19, we have seen that it's moved from the intent has almost, in the student body, the intent has almost moved from collecting knowledge to instead, how do we move through and get through these assignments? Because there's so many other stressors, there's so many other things that are influencing your daily lives. The intent that you're putting into the work has kind of shifted, and you're no longer in a setting or surrounded by a setting which really fosters this idea of collecting knowledge. Now more so it becomes a task that you're trying to move through, and so in that sense you get a tangible impact on people's academics. Intangibly, there's a plethora of emotional, psychological, all kinds of impacts that this pandemic has had on students across the country. For many students, the university, whatever university they attend, it acts almost as a guide. It filters, it kind of protects students from all these outside factors that can really shift, alter, and negatively impact them from wherever they come from. Wherever their background is. There's a lot more variables that go into their everyday experience when students return home, when students aren't able to be at their university communities. And so that really kind of presents a challenge for a lot of students when they return back home and have to now juggle all these variables they weren't juggling before on a university campus. And then lastly, it's also an intangible impact psychologically when we think of universities almost as a stable, concrete fixture and institution in our everyday lives. Now having seen that this can be altered, that this can be shifted, and it can be done in such a short span of time, we went off to to spring break. And in our case, we never came back. It was one day we're extending spring break by a week. The next day, we won't see y'all until August at the soonest. And so to see that, our structures and our institutions and things that seem so concrete can be changed and altered so quickly, that really can have a negative impact on people's feeling of stability, their sense of direction, all those type of things. So in that sense, those are a couple of the examples of intangible impacts it has had, as well as the tangible impacts it's had on academics.
Thank you so much for that, Miles. That's very helpful for us to know. But hang on to that. We have some other questions for you that are going to take a little bit deeper dive into what you just said. The great promise of post-secondary education, today is a pathway to economic mobility. Yet in 2018, 23% of African Americans aged 25 to 29 held a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 44% of their white peers. And then we look at the completion rates, for underrepresented students, just 25%. Low income and first generation college students will go on to graduate school or quality first job. Those kind of statistics, along with the ones that Cole mentioned earlier, have been astounding. So Amy, this is the premise upon which you've built Braven, what you've learned in your helping underrepresented students about their ability, to get quality first jobs. Can you share with us how you've helped students in this demographic to gain that experience, those skills, and build those networks to make that successful transition possible?
Sure. Thank you so much also for having me on this panel today. Daryl, what you're saying and the data that Nicole presented earlier is completely why, as a former sixth grade teacher and then a talent nerd and a person who experienced economic mobility myself through my own parents, it was just never lost on me how important, if you were able to get an education, and if you were able to get a bachelor's degree, it could be to changing the economic trajectory of your entire family unit. And before COVID hit, young people who were first in their families to go to college on the Pell Grant were coming out earning 66 cents on the dollar to their higher income peers. So there was already a great recession happening for that group of young people. And now it will be exacerbated for sure as a result of what's happening now. And what we have been able to do is work in partnerships with highly innovative large state schools, Rutgers, Newark, San Jose State, Lehman College in New York, and also a smaller school in Chicago, very committed to first generation students, National Louis University, to build what is now a credit-bearing course for students who are sophomores or transfer juniors from community college, who actually have the time and the space that they need to really get ready for the professional workforce post-college. And that course is a 3-unit course like any other course on the campus. 80% is online. We got super lucky in this way, because with COVID and everything going virtual, that 80% that I was always like, it's fine, but I'm a people person. That 20% that was in person in the learning lab between the coach and the cohort, I was like, that's where the magic happens, because that's where we're able to bring in employers to have their talent coaching these teams of 5 to 8, which is really how we were manufacturing social capital. And that said, our students were coming out on the back end, and they were out earning their entire family units, close to 50% of them, within 5 semesters, which is what the American dream looks like and looks like in action. 73% of our students, in comparison to 49% of other students from large state schools like them, were getting internships, which is a key lever, honestly, to being able to move economically over time from a mobility standpoint. And then finally, 72% of our students were earning the full dollar. That means there was still a set that we were working tirelessly to make sure that they did too, but that was far higher than their peer group, which was doing that at about a 49% rate as well. And so we just feel super lucky to be in deep partnership with colleges who really had gotten before this moment how important it was to have the ability to help young people not only get an extraordinary education, but also think about how to apply and get that education and put it to work, as you all say at Strata so well, completion with a purpose, and do that really quickly upon graduation. So we continue to support students for another 2.5 years through the Braven model. And so what we've realized is this is a solvable problem as long as there's the right intentionality between higher education and employers, and then in our case, a nonprofit working all together.
That's a great point to make, Jaime, when you talk about employers, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. So thanks for sharing. Michael, with all this great data and what you've heard from Miles and Jaime thus far, how should education and workforce policymakers respond to what we're seeing in this data as we begin to think about recovery and the pathway forward? And do one-size solutions, fit in this day and time?
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you for Strata for having me and the panelists. I think there's not a nuanced response. I mean, the way that education and workforce policymakers should be looking at this data, it's pretty clear that our post-secondary education and training systems are simply just not up for the moment. They're not up for the challenge, right? We have seen with COVID, the really difficult time we had kind of shifting to really meet the needs of learners, of working learners. There were institutions who, there were faculty on institutions who were literally having to teach online courses, for the first time ever. Like, even though we've had kind of growing enrollment in institutions like WGU in Southern New Hampshire. And so these data reflect that there's a lack of confidence in people's understanding of what post-secondary programming and training can do for them in the economy. You see the tentativeness, in the decisions. They're not sure, that they know that they need to be trained. You see that pretty clearly in the data. They're not sure how they're going to do it. There's a complete lack of support and guidance. So policymakers really need to step back and take a look at the fact that our post-secondary education and training systems really need to be modernized to be much more responsive to the labor market. Our post-secondary and training systems are very supply side, and we really need to be more nimble and help people have confidence that their education and training options will actually line up employment opportunities. And then finally, I'll say, that it's not just about kind of integration, right, of kind of our post-secondary and education training systems to the labor market. We actually need new models, so what have we learned from WGUs, from the Southern New Hampshires? How do we begin to kind of more directly interact with the demand side? How do we build in technology? It's been so critical in the transition post-COVID. And so I think that policymakers here have a lot of work to do to kind of step up and meet the moment and provide the support to American people to navigate kind of education and training at a time of, just instability and really confusion about the signaling of education and training.
That's very helpful, Michael. We're going to get into a little bit of a discussion around the job market that was supposed to be very strong and where we are right now. And I think your points will help lead us into that discussion. Um, a recent analysis from NCAN shows that the FAFSA renewals from current college students are down considerably from last year. And in the Strata data, we're seeing the large numbers of learners, especially Latino and Black Americans, report to cancel or delay enrollment. So, Amy, what can institutions do to stay connected to students to ensure that they re-engage? And how is this changing the way in which you support students and institution as part of your work at Braven?
Yeah, so in my opinion, those are very distressing numbers. If you just think about the bigger picture in terms of how important a post-secondary degree is to economic mobility often over time. I also think one of the things that we're seeing right now in the labor market is just the deep divides in terms of the country, in terms of people who really have had access to economic mobility and those who have not. Just because we've had a roaring stock market is not necessarily, at least in the world of Braven, the economy that our students are actually facing and are working in. And I do want to make sure that I'm drawing a very stark picture between what I think some people would say, oh, we're bouncing right back. And that is not what we are hearing and we're seeing from our young folks who are in Braven and also their family units as we're hearing about the struggles that people are having to get reemployed, et cetera, while actively doing that. And so on the college front, I actually think there's an outsized responsibility that colleges have to play at this point in time because they are the great equalizers, or it can be the great equalizers. And so one, I would say being very close to their current students and making sure they're doing everything possible to ensure that their students who've been on Pell Grants and on financial aid are coming back to school, whether that's online or in person, depending on how the school is maneuvering for the fall. The second thing is for students who are entering or who are supposed to enter, doing everything possible that they can to encourage them to still come, along with being in partnership with community-based organizations and high schools as well, to just make sure that they're helping that group of young people still make the choice, if they can, to come to college and make it financially affordable for them to do so. And then finally, just the role that I know all professors know that they play in advisors and just people who have had powerful relationships with young people, and from a mentorship standpoint, really saying this is not the time to stop out, because one of the things that we know is often when students stop out, they never return. So really having other people pull students into the ecosystem as well. And then finally, I do think it is really critical for post-secondary institutions to be able to help their students as their customers see what the value is going to be on the back end of that degree, especially if along the way young people are acquiring debt. Really making sure that they're doing everything possible to have the career services and other supports in place, and the connections to employers to help make sure that after college there is a real viable economic option. And that is where I do think there's a lot of really creative innovation that could be done. It doesn't have to be a revolution, but definitely an evolution of some of our higher ed institutions to really think about how do you restructure a bit to make sure that you're giving students the time and the space, and honestly creating the network opportunities for them to actually get connected much faster to the world of work.
That's very helpful. And I think it'll lead us right into this next part of the conversation as we talk about sort of that pathway forward and thinking about, we were talking about one of the strongest job markets in generations here just a few months ago, and now we're not. So I do want to explore that a little bit more, Michael, with your comment in the last answer that you made. Returning to school was a good bet during a time of recession. It was something that people typically did. But we have reason to believe with the data we're seeing that the timing right now is very different. What do you think of that?
Well, I think when I look at the data, I see a lot of uncertainty, and I think that people are confused. And in the trajectory of our post-secondary education and training systems, we're really at an inflection point, right? We've been having a national debate around the value of post-secondary, and unfortunately, there's a lot of noise in that debate, right? So you have people coming out and kind of questioning whether or not college is worth it. you know, because you know, the data is pretty clear. Like on average, it is a very good thing to do. Now it does get complex because it is an average, right? Payoff is an average, and there is vast, you know, difference, earnings difference depending on major, right? So I think that we really need to really sort the population we're talking about. So like Amy was saying, you know, and we have to sort the short term versus long term. I actually think that people who are, if you're low income and you are enrolled in a selective institution, that is a very good thing for you, the data suggests, right? So to the earlier point, stopping out, you know, I think the data suggests would be a big mistake, right? You need to go there. I'll say that the data that you have, the tentativeness of some people of kind of jumping right back in makes a lot of sense, right? Given the uncertainty and the, you know, heterogeneity of payoff, you know, going back to Amy's point, you know, if there is data that a credential that someone's seeking is going to have an economic payoff, then, you know, let's move forward. But because there's so much uncertainty, you know, I think that we see that people are tentative because there is a cost, right? There's a cost. You know, education is not free. There's a cost, there's an opportunity cost, there's a financial cost. And I think that we're seeing people being very tentative. And if we look at kind of labor market information as we try to figure out kind of where the economy is going to land, I think some of that tentativeness for the people who are not in those kind of selective institutions and those longer term programs that can ride, you know, potentially ride out the recession, you know, I think that some of the tentativeness is warranted. But I'm going to go back to, before closing here, I go back to my earlier point. I think that we have missed an opportunity to have our post-secondary education and training systems be more nimble to help people kind of navigate this moment, right? Like we really need to speed up the way that we integrate post-secondary with training, connecting that to employers so that we can be more nimble and helping people make sense of disruptions in the economy as we're moving forward. So I think, you know, from what I've seen with your data, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to be tentative and really be thinking about kind of the economic payoff of the options that people are going to be taking.
Yeah.
That's helpful. And Miles, you're a rising senior, but many of your peers graduating, you're graduating in the next year or planning to graduate. What are you hearing from them and how do you feel about this particular topic?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, a lot, everybody's unsure in whatever field that they're interested in and whatever field that they're planning to pursue, whether they plan on going into the job market, whether they plan on continuing on into education. Everybody's unsure of what is to come and what they should do. And so we're seeing a lot of students, you know, having conversation of, do I want to extend my undergraduate career? Do I want to extend my, you know, my scholastic career and go into grad school when they haven't thought about that before? I have a friend who just, you know, the moment that the university said we're moving online, as soon as the university moved online, they went and applied for a graduate program to get their master's degree just immediately because they didn't want to go into the job market and they didn't know what that reality would hold. And so it really depends. You know, I'm personally interested in going to law school after I graduate. And so in those circles, we hear a lot of students who are saying, you know, on that side, do we want to go to law school now? Do we want to have our law school experience be online potentially? What do we want out of that experience? And so they instead are looking, well, maybe we want to go pursue fellowships, pursue a job, pursue internships. So they might move back to the market. So it's really an interesting kind of dynamic that we're seeing because on both sides, it's almost as if those who planned on going to graduate school, what we're seeing is, oh, we want to go into the job market. Those who weren't planning on going to grad school and were planning to go in the job market, they're saying the reality of the job market isn't what we expected. Maybe perhaps we want to go into academics. So it's almost like we're seeing a reversal on either side, whatever side you originally found yourself on. It's almost as if you're flipping. And that's kind of what I've seen from my fellow peers and students and all that kind of stuff.
Great. Well, we have a wonderful audience here. Thank you guys so much for that, for those wonderful answers. But we do want to get the audience involved in this. So I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Jenna Talbot, who's going to take some questions from all those who are on the phone and continue this conversation. Jenna.
Great. Thanks, Daryl. Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. Yes, so lots coming in here. You can put your questions in the Q&A. We'll try to answer as much as we can in the next 7 minutes or so. But you know, Miles, I think there's a lot of interest in our audience from hearing for you. One of the questions here is, given that campus life may be partially disrupted for the fall, are you or your peers, are you talking about discounts in tuition or fees? What are you thinking about that topic?
I think we see a kind of a diversity of opinions in that. There definitely are some students who are coming at this question from the standpoint that, you know, if we're not in person, if we're, you know, online, if our ability to utilize, you know, all the different campus resources, which we expected to use when we, you know, applied, got admitted and then decided to go to the university, if we're not receiving those services, then some people are definitely, you know, of the mindset that they would like a refund, they would like, you know, cheaper tuition, cheaper student fees, all those kinds of things. But there's also students too of the standpoint that we understand in this kind of economy and in this recession that we're in now, doing that could very much compromise a university's ability to, you know, provide services and to provide education. And how does that affect also all the people who are employed by universities? Because, you know, there's a finite amount of money, and, you know, just speaking from the University of Miami's perspective, you know, if our university were to cut tuition and were to cut costs of fees and all that kind of stuff, it would drastically impact their ability to continue to, you know, employ all the people they do, to provide all the services that they do. So it's a difficult conversation because, you know, students, from one standpoint, they would like that kind of economic benefit of, you know, not having to pay all this money, especially when it's not what they initially envisioned. But at the same time too, you know, if you do, you know, get that money back, that money is being taken away from something else. And in reality, it might be best to, you know, pay the same amount and then still receive, you know, the same level of, you know, services, teaching, all that kind of stuff that would be there if the university has the financial resources it needs. So it's kind of, you know, it's a two-pronged answer, but there is really a diversity of opinion in that. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing. And maybe likewise, I'd be curious what you're hearing from your students, maybe both on the topic of coming back to the fall, but also internships, right? We're hearing that a lot of internships have been canceled. Employers might be moving to virtual. Share a little bit about what you're hearing from some of the folks you're serving.
Yeah, so for people who just graduated in the last couple months, there are 500,000 young people who just graduated or are about to graduate who are first in their families to go to college on the Pell Grant. People in our community are absolutely very, very concerned, as are our college partners, about what will happen to them in this economy that we're in. Because what we know is young people in general who come out during a downturn never reap the benefits. Like they never catch up. There becomes a scarring effect, according to the economists. And so one of the things that I'm seeing that's super inspiring is that our college partners of Rutgers, Newark, San Jose State, Lehman, and National Louis here in Chicago, we work together with them to actually design a 2-week intensive for seniors who are graduating right now, to help them get what they needed to have in their toolkit, in particular a contingency plan, so that students can truly think about how do you pathway into a strong role that allows you to have economic mobility over time, like just not let this all happen to you, but really take control as much as you can of this situation. And that's something that I do think that colleges need to make sure that they're doing. What we also did was open it up to far more schools. So Spelman now is participating, Middle Tennessee State, high-performing college access organizations like One Goal, and charter management organizations like KIP for their alumni also have decided to participate in the Brave and Booster. And what's been really interesting is that some of those organizations asked us to open it up to their students who were seniors a year or two ago, which has been interesting because we also know that sort of first in is often first out of many, many jobs. And so they're worried about those younger alums who also worked really hard. And so I would say on the college end, just really thinking through whatever colleges can do, because we are absolutely hearing from our students how concerned they are. And even if they are like sophomores or juniors, they are concerned looking at what is to come. The other thing I would say on the internship side, we have absolutely seen a lot of internships rescinded, but we've seen a lot of internships that are going to move forward. However, one of the things that we're hearing from our students is that a virtual internship is very different than an internship where you get to go into a place of business and honestly get the mentorship that you often get in an internship. And we're also hearing that from our employer partners as well. People are really afraid about what will that experience be? Will you really get to know your interns, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that I know that we've seen in the world of Braven is that who you know matters mightily, period, in the sentence. Social capital, networking is how people get jobs over time and often get promotions over time. And so one of the things I think on the employer end, there's going to have to be a lot of intentionality and a lot of deliberateness to make sure that there are virtual internships when it's safe for people to be in person again, for there to be those kinds of internships, and that people are really looking at where those interns are coming from. Because often, even in my world, as running a nonprofit, the number of calls that I get to have interns whose parents are amazing human beings who also can help them get that social capital has been fascinating. And so just the internship is often a way for students to get a leg up into the workforce, and they're either being rescinded or in the world of social distancing, I would say there's a real distance that I think people aren't getting their heads around for young people who don't have the social capital networks around them to really have those internships that set them up for a strong career over time.
Thank you. I know we're coming up on we usually do these conversations in an hour, so we're squeezing a lot in. But I do want to get to one other question, specifically coming back to the data. Nicole, this is for you, although I think, after you share, I'd love to get the rest of the perspectives of the panelists, and then we'll hand it over to Daryl to close us out. But the question is, any speculation as to why African-American and Latinx respondents would be more interested in a degree than whites? Is that political ideology, or perhaps white respondents already have a degree? I think you've dug into some of this already. Can you speak to that?
Sure. And yeah, I saw that question pop up in the chat, so thanks. So the particular slide that we shared, we had some of those same questions. And so at first I'd cut it for everyone and found that, and then ended up the one that was shared in the presentation was just people without degrees. So we see even when you sort of control for that level of education that there are those differences. That's been something that we've seen consistently in our research, as was mentioned at the beginning. We've been surveying people since 2016, over 350,000 Americans, and it's been a really consistent theme in terms of the appetite and interest for higher education, that we see that it's higher among, Latinos and Black Americans, those communities of color. I think the biggest motivation we see for getting that education is all about relating to what's going to get people a better job. And we see, depending on where people live, there are different kinds of education requirements for the jobs that people are seeking. So people who are living in more urban areas, also we see having, higher interest in higher education. And I think that's pretty much our most universal finding, is just people are motivated if they see that education is going to take them higher. And so that's kind of what they need to see in order to have the, pay the costs that Michael was talking about, both the direct costs and all the opportunity costs that come with getting an education.
Michael or Miles, anyone else want to chime in?
We're just about out of time. I think we really need to also say here that because of structural and systemic racism, it actually, there's some evidence that you actually have to have a degree to actually make less than white people who don't have a degree. So I think that there's some inflation there because, Blacks at all levels, regardless of credential, actually make less on the dollar than whites. And frankly, Black people with bachelor's degrees even often earn lower than whites without them. So there is that element of this. It's not just cultural. We think education is important. I think there's some structural things happening in the labor market that also inflates it.
Yeah, there's a Brookings Institute study that completely highlights what Michael just said in terms of the disparities racially and income-wise in terms of first generation college students, even with a bachelor's degree, under earning by the end of their career young people from high income families with a high school diploma.
I think there's a lot more that we could dig into there. I wish we had a little bit more time. Daryl, I'll pass it back over to you, but I think there's a part 2 of this conversation that is definitely needed.
Certainly do agree. Thank you, Jenna. On behalf of our colleagues at Strata Education Network, I want to thank our panelists. These guys are wonderful partners of ours in many different ways. Miles, Aimee, and Michael, really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. I want to thank you all for joining us as a part of this conversation as we continue our public viewpoint efforts through our Center for Consumer Insights. I think our Consumer Insights team has done a great job. It's been a pleasure working with them to pull us together. It's obvious that this conversation is not over. I think this is the very beginning of a conversation, and we'll have to figure out a way to continue it. So remember, stay in touch with us through our website. We have a lot of information there, and we look forward to talking with you again soon. And we hope that we see you very soon. Take care.
Thank you.